The story of the United States begins thousands of years ago, with the original peoples of North America. Indigenous nations like the Iroquois, Cherokee, Lakota, Navajo, and many others lived across the continent, each with complex cultures, spiritual traditions, and systems of governance. The Iroquois Confederacy, for instance, had a sophisticated political alliance long before European settlers arrived. The Mississippian cultures constructed vast ceremonial mounds, and the ancestral Puebloans built cliff cities that still stand today. The land was not empty. It was vibrant, alive, and deeply rooted in thousands of years of history. In the late 15th century, that world began to change dramatically. European powers began exploring the Americas, driven by ambitions of trade, land, wealth, and religious expansion. The Spanish were first, establishing a stronghold in Central and South America and reaching parts of the present-day southern U.S. The French followed, focusing on fur trading and alliances with indigenous groups in the interior of North America. The Dutch briefly established colonies like New Netherland, which would become New York. But it was the English who ultimately created the foundation of what would become the United States. In 1607, the English established Jamestown, Virginia, their first permanent settlement in North America. It was a risky and nearly disastrous venture. The settlers faced starvation, disease, and tense relations with local Powhatan tribes. 13 years later, in 1620, the Pilgrims landed in what would become Massachusetts. Seeking religious freedom, they signed the Mayflower Compact, an early form of self-government. Over the next century, English settlers established 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. These colonies were not a monolith. They differed in religion, economy, and governance. The New England colonies were dominated by Puritan ethics and small farming communities. The middle colonies were religiously and culturally diverse, serving as hubs of commerce and agriculture. The southern colonies developed plantation economies that depended heavily on enslaved African labor, producing cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. Despite these differences, the colonies grew increasingly interdependent, bound together by shared language, trade networks, and a growing sense of identity separate from Britain. Initially, the British government practiced a policy known as salutary neglect, allowing the colonies a degree of self-rule while focusing attention on European affairs. Colonial assemblies emerged, and local leaders gained experience in governance. But everything changed after the 7 Years' War, known in the colonies as the French and Indian War. It ended in 1763 with Britain gaining control over large parts of North America, but at a steep cost. Britain emerged victorious but deeply in debt, and it expected its colonies to help pay. The Crown imposed new taxes and restrictions to raise revenue and tighten control: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts. These measures were met with fierce resistance. Colonists argued they had no representation in Parliament and should not be taxed without their consent. Protests and boycotts spread. In 1770, tensions boiled over when British soldiers opened fire on a crowd in Boston, killing 5 colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party saw American patriots dump British tea into the harbor in protest of a monopoly and tax. Britain responded with the Coercive Acts, intended to punish Massachusetts, but which instead galvanized opposition. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They petitioned the Crown for redress, but also began preparations for resistance. By April 1775, open conflict erupted when British troops and colonial militias clashed at Lexington and Concord. The Revolutionary War had begun. Initially, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation, but the violence changed minds. In July 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, authored primarily by Thomas Jefferson. It was a radical document. It proclaimed that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The war that followed was brutal and uncertain. Britain held enormous advantages: a professional army, the most powerful navy in the world, and vast resources. The colonies had militias, limited supplies, and internal divisions. Yet they also had advantages. They knew the terrain, fought for their homes and beliefs, and had the leadership of George Washington. The turning point came in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga, convincing France to ally with the revolutionaries. French troops, ships, and funds were decisive. In 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally recognized the United States as an independent nation. But winning independence was only the beginning. The new country was fragile. It had no king, no established government, and no consensus on how to govern. The first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, created a weak national government. It could not tax, regulate trade, or enforce laws. Economic turmoil and internal unrest, like Shays' Rebellion in 1786, exposed these weaknesses. A new framework was needed. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia to write a new constitution. The Constitution, signed in 1787 and ratified a year later, created a stronger federal government with three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, along with a system of checks and balances. It was revolutionary in design, but controversial. Some feared a strong central authority. To ensure ratification, supporters promised a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, press, and protection from government overreach. With this compromise, the Constitution became law, and George Washington was elected the first President of the United States in 1789. The early republic faced enormous tasks: managing debt, setting up institutions, and navigating foreign threats. Under Washington, and later presidents like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the young country tested its identity. Political divisions emerged. Federalists favored a strong central government and close ties with Britain. Democratic Republicans championed states' rights and closer ties with France, but both agreed on expansion. In 1803, President Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, doubling the size of the country. Lewis and Clark's expedition followed, mapping the vast West and fueling dreams of a continental nation. Expansion brought opportunity, but also conflict. The War of 1812, sparked by British interference with American trade and the impressment of sailors, tested the nation's resolve. Though militarily inconclusive, the war boosted American nationalism and secured U.S. control over its territory. Meanwhile, westward migration accelerated. Settlers poured into the Ohio Valley, then into the Great Plains. The belief in manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were destined to spread from coast to coast, became national dogma. But expansion came at a cost. Indigenous nations were forced off their lands through treaties, warfare, and policies like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which led to the Trail of Tears. Millions of acres were seized. At the same time, a deepening moral and political crisis over slavery divided the nation. The South's economy depended on enslaved labor, while abolitionist movements grew in the North. Each new state added to the Union raised the question: would it allow slavery? In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president on a platform that opposed the expansion of slavery. Southern states saw this as a direct threat. One by one, 11 states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. The Civil War began in 1861, the deadliest conflict in U.S. history. Over 600,000 Americans died. The war was fought over states' rights, federal authority, and at its core, slavery. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be free. It reframed the war as a fight for human liberty. After years of bloodshed, Union forces defeated the Confederacy in 1865. Lincoln was assassinated just days after victory. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th and 15th Amendments extended citizenship and voting rights to formerly enslaved people. Reconstruction followed, a period of rebuilding the South and integrating millions of freed African Americans into society. But progress was uneven. Resistance in the South was fierce. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged. Northern interest waned. By 1877, federal troops withdrew. and Southern states passed Jim Crow laws, enforcing segregation and disenfranchising black citizens for nearly a century. Despite setbacks, the nation industrialized rapidly. The late 1800s saw the rise of railroads, factories, and urban centers. Waves of immigrants arrived from Europe and Asia, transforming the American population. The U.S. emerged as a global power, fought in 2 world wars, endured a Great Depression, and confronted its legacy of inequality through the Civil Rights Movement. From a collection of colonies to a continent-spanning democracy, the United States has been shaped by struggle, ideals, contradictions, and transformation. Its story is not one of perfection, but of constant reinvention. A country born in revolution, defined by diversity, and always striving to become a more perfect union. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like the videos and subscribe to my channel for more content about history.